Hey guys, tonight we begin with a civilization that gave the world aqueducts, concrete, and legal systems, and also thought a shared sponge on a stick was a perfectly acceptable bathroom solution. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. I always love seeing how far these stories travel. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Let's begin with something that would feel instantly uncomfortable to most modern people: public bathrooms. Now imagine walking into a restroom and discovering that it is basically a long stone bench with holes in it. No stalls, no doors, no polite illusion of privacy. Just a row of people sitting shoulder to shoulder. Welcome to ancient Rome. Roman public toilets, called latrini, were communal spaces. Large stone benches ran along the walls with evenly spaced openings carved into them. Beneath those seats, a constant flow of water carried waste away through the city's sewer system. The engineering was genuinely impressive. The experience, slightly less so. Because if you needed to use the restroom, you simply walked in, found an empty spot, sat down next to whoever was already there, and continued your day like nothing unusual was happening. Your neighbour might be a baker, or a soldier, or someone discussing grain prices while making direct eye contact. This was completely normal. Roman toilets were actually social spaces. People talked, exchanged gossip, debated politics, and generally treated the experience like a very casual public gathering, which means the phrase bathroom conversation was taken extremely literally. And then there was the cleaning situation. Romans did not use toilet paper. Instead, they used something called a tersorium. This was a sponge attached to a stick. After use, it was rinsed in a shallow channel of water that ran along the floor in front of the seats. Sometimes vinegar or salt water was used to clean it. And then it went right back for the next person. Yes, shared by everyone. The Romans likely saw this as practical. Water was constantly flowing, the sponge was cleaned, and the system worked for a city of over 1 million people. From a modern perspective, however, the moment you hear the words communal sponge, your brain immediately begins planning a fast and quiet exit. Still, it says a lot about Roman culture. They were comfortable doing many things in public that we prefer to keep private: bathing, exercising, discussing politics, and apparently this. To the Romans, it was just another part of city life, efficient, communal, and deeply concerning if you think about it for more than 5 seconds. Now that we have survived the Roman bathroom experience, let's talk about laundry. Because the Romans loved clean clothes, they just had a very unusual method of achieving that goal. Across Roman cities, there were public laundries called fulonicae. These places were responsible for cleaning tunics, cloaks, and other garments worn by the population. Laundry was serious business, especially in a crowded city like Rome, where dust, sweat, and general urban chaos were part of daily life. And the key cleaning ingredient was urine. Yes, actual urine. Now, before we judge the Romans too harshly, there was some real chemistry behind this decision. Urine contains ammonia, which is a powerful natural cleaning agent. It helps break down oils and dirt in fabric. So in purely scientific terms, the Romans were correct. In purely sensory terms, it probably smelled terrible. Workers at these laundries collected urine from large public jars placed around the city. Citizens would conveniently deposit their contribution throughout the day. The collected liquid was then transported to the laundry, where it became part of the washing process. Once there, garments were placed into large stone vats filled with water and urine, and then the workers climbed inside. Their job was to stomp on the clothes. Imagine standing ankle deep in a vat of ancient detergent, rhythmically stepping on someone's toga for several minutes while trying not to think too hard about the ingredients. This was essentially the Roman version of a washing machine, a very personal washing machine. After the garments were thoroughly stomped and cleaned, they were rinsed with water, brushed, and sometimes treated with clay or sulphur to help whiten the fabric. The result was fresh, bright clothing, which, considering the method, is honestly impressive. The practice was so widespread that it even became part of Roman taxation. Emperor Vespasian introduced a tax on the collection of urine from public sources. When someone complained about the unpleasant origin of the tax, Vespasian reportedly held up a coin and said a phrase that became famous throughout history: pecunia non olet, money does not smell, which may be true, but the laundry vats probably did. Now, after discussing Roman bathrooms and Roman laundry, you might assume hygiene in ancient Rome was a bit questionable. But here's the twist. The Romans actually loved bathing. In fact, they were obsessed with it. Almost every major Roman city had massive public bath complexes called thermae. These were not small neighbourhood bathhouses. They were enormous architectural projects that could cover entire city blocks. Some baths were so large they contained gardens, libraries, exercise courtyards, massage rooms, swimming pools, and enormous heated bathing halls. The baths of Caracalla in Rome could host thousands of visitors every day, but there was one small detail that might surprise modern visitors. Everyone bathed together. Public baths were communal spaces where large numbers of people gathered daily to relax, socialise, and clean themselves. After exercising in the palestra, visitors would move through a sequence of rooms. First came the warm room, called the tepidarium, then the hot room, the coldarium, where heated pools and steam opened the pores. Finally, the cold plunge in the frigidarium. It was a carefully designed routine that Romans believed was essential for health, and almost everyone was naked, which, to the Romans, was completely normal. You might find senators, merchants, soldiers, and philosophers all relaxing in the same bath complex. People talked business, debated politics, exchanged gossip, and generally treated the baths as one of the most important social spaces in Roman life. In some ways, they functioned like a mix of gym, spa, coffee shop, and networking event. Except everyone was sitting in hot water. Bath attendants also helped scrape dirt and oil from the skin using curved metal tools called strigils. Instead of soap, Romans covered their bodies with olive oil, which trapped dirt and sweat. The strigil then scraped the mixture away. It sounds slightly uncomfortable, but apparently it worked. Bathhouses were also incredibly advanced technologically. Roman engineers used a system called the hypocaust to heat floors and walls with hot air circulating beneath the building. So while the Romans may have shared communal sponges in the bathroom and washed clothes and urine, they also built some of the most sophisticated bathing facilities the world had ever seen. Which leads to a strange conclusion. Ancient Rome may have had questionable methods, but they were very committed to staying clean while using them. Now that we've survived Roman bathrooms, Roman laundry, and Roman group bathing, it's time to talk about something more relaxing. Dinner. Except in ancient Rome, dinner did not involve chairs. If you were wealthy enough, you didn't sit at the table at all. You reclined. Roman elites held formal dinner parties called convivium, and the dining room was arranged very differently from what we are used to today. Instead of chairs, there were large couches placed around a low central table. Guests stretched out sideways on these couches, leaning on their left elbow while eating with their right hand. Yes, entire meals were eaten while lying down. This posture was meant to symbolize leisure and status. Sitting upright like a normal person was associated with servants or lower social classes. Reclining meant you had the luxury of time, comfort, and servants bringing you food. It also meant digestion was about to become a very adventurous experience. A typical Roman dinner for the wealthy involved several courses. The meal might begin with small appetizers such as eggs, olives, and salads. Then came the main dishes: roasted meats, fish, vegetables, sauces flavoured with herbs and garum, the famous fermented fish sauce that the Romans added to almost everything. And yes, garum smelled exactly the way fermented fish sauce sounds like it would smell. Servants constantly moved through the room, bringing more plates, pouring diluted wine, and removing finished dishes. Guests talked, joked, debated politics, and sometimes listened to musicians or poetry readings. Dinner parties could last for hours, and the reclining position made the entire atmosphere feel more like lounging than eating. Of course, reclining also made things slightly chaotic when too much wine entered the picture. Wine in Roman culture was almost always mixed with water, but that did not prevent guests from drinking quite a lot of it. By the end of the evening, the couches might be filled with people who were very relaxed, possibly too relaxed. Still, this was considered the height of sophistication. To a Roman aristocrat, reclining while eating was elegant, civilized, and refined. To a modern observer, it might look a little like a group of people attempting to eat dinner during a very slow-motion nap. But in ancient Rome, this was the proper way to dine. And apparently nobody was worried about spilling wine on the cushions. When most people picture ancient Rome, they imagine something very clean and majestic. White marble temples, perfect statues, elegant columns glowing in the Mediterranean sun. In reality, Roman cities looked a lot more like modern cities than we often admit, and that includes graffiti. Lots of it. Walk through the preserved ruins of Pompeii today, and you will see thousands of inscriptions scratched into the walls of houses, taverns, streets, and public buildings. Some are political messages, some advertise businesses, some praise famous gladiators, and some are just people being people. Romans wrote love notes on walls. They insulted their rivals. They bragged about their romantic achievements, sometimes with a level of detail that would make modern social media moderators very uncomfortable. One famous inscription reads something roughly equivalent to, "I wonder, wall, that you have not collapsed under the weight of so much nonsense written on you," which means even 2,000 years ago, someone was already tired of graffiti. Other messages were simpler. Marcus loves Julia. Vote for Lucius for magistrate. Secundus was here. Human history, summarized. The graffiti also reveals something fascinating about Roman literacy. A surprising number of people could read and write at least basic messages. Graffiti became a form of public conversation, almost like an ancient comment section carved directly into plaster. Political campaigns even used walls for advertising. Candidates running for local office encouraged supporters to paint endorsements on buildings. You might walk through a street and see multiple recommendations for different politicians. In other words, Roman walls doubled as campaign posters. Taverns and brothels had their own graffiti traditions. Customers left reviews, jokes, and occasionally complaints. If you think modern online reviews can be harsh, imagine carving your dissatisfaction permanently into someone's wall. Food was terrible, service worse. Except now it is preserved for archaeologists, 2,000 years later. What makes this so charming is how familiar it feels. Despite the marble architecture and ancient history, the voices scratched into these walls sound incredibly modern. People joking, people flirting, people complaining. Civilizations rise and fall. Empires expand and collapse. But one thing apparently never changes. Give humans a blank wall, and someone will absolutely write on it. After walking through busy Roman streets, listening to vendors shouting and carts rattling across stone roads, eventually you would get hungry. Now, you might imagine Roman families going home to carefully prepared meals cooked in private kitchens. But for a large part of the population, that wasn't how daily life worked. Many Roman homes, especially in crowded apartment buildings called insulae, didn't have proper kitchens. Cooking indoors was risky because of fires, and space was limited. So instead, people ate out, constantly. And this is where ancient Rome begins to feel strangely modern. Across Roman cities there were small street food shops called thermopolia. These were essentially ancient fast food counters. They had large stone or brick counters facing the street with big ceramic jars embedded into the surface. Inside those jars were ready-made meals, stews, lentils, beans, cooked meats, vegetables simmering in sauces, sometimes wine or hot drinks. Customers would walk up, order something simple, and eat right there or take it with them. It was quick, convenient, and affordable. If this sounds suspiciously similar to grabbing lunch from a food stall or takeaway counter today, that's because it basically was. Archaeologists studying the ruins of Pompeii have identified more than 80 thermopolia throughout the city. Some still contain the original painted decorations showing the food that was served there. In other words, the Romans even had menu images. Ancient marketing. These places were especially popular among workers, travellers, and people living in small apartments. Instead of cooking every meal, they simply stopped by their local food stall. The atmosphere was probably loud and lively. Merchants shouting, people gathering around counters, the smell of stews and bread filling the air. And just like modern fast food spots, some establishments had better reputations than others. You probably knew which stall served the best lentil stew, and which one you should avoid unless you were feeling very brave. Roman street food wasn't fancy. It wasn't elegant like the reclining dinner parties of the wealthy, but it was practical. Quick meals for busy people in a crowded city. Which means that 2,000 years before drive-through windows, Rome had already invented something very familiar: dinner on the go. If you walked through the streets of ancient Rome for long enough, you would eventually notice something else. People were gambling, constantly. Dice games were wildly popular across Roman society. Soldiers played them, merchants played them, labourers played them. Even senators occasionally joined in, although they usually tried to pretend it was all very dignified. It was not. Roman dice, called tesserae, looked very similar to the ones we use today. Small cubes, marked with numbers, tossed onto tables or boards while players placed wagers. Sometimes the wagers were small, sometimes they were not small. Money, jewellery, clothing, and even personal belongings could end up on the table. And when the dice rolled badly, things could get tense very quickly. Officially, gambling in Rome was heavily restricted. Outside of certain festivals, betting money was technically illegal. But like many laws throughout history, enforcement was flexible. People gambled anyway. You can even see physical evidence of it today. Archaeologists have discovered gaming boards carved directly into stone steps, benches, and public buildings. Players simply scratched out game boards wherever they found a flat surface. Which means that at some point, 2,000 years ago, someone looked at a marble step and thought, "This seems like a good place to lose my money." Taverns were especially popular places for gambling. These establishments were loud, crowded, and often filled with players shouting, arguing, and celebrating their victories. Wine flowed freely. Dice clattered against wooden tables. Arguments probably broke out frequently. And occasionally, the authorities tried to stop it. Roman law technically banned gambling except during the winter festival of Saturnalia, when social rules were temporarily relaxed and everyone was allowed to indulge in games of chance. During that week, gambling exploded across the city, but even when Saturnalia ended, the dice rarely stopped rolling. Roman writers often complained about gambling addiction. Some people lost enormous sums of money, sometimes even their homes, which sounds strangely familiar. 2,000 years later, casinos, betting apps, and lottery tickets still attract millions of hopeful players. The tools may have changed, but the human desire to test luck against fate, that part hasn't changed at all. The Romans understood the thrill perfectly, and they were more than willing to roll the dice. Now here is a Roman habit that would cause absolute chaos today. Naming children. Modern families usually try to give each child a unique name. It helps with identity, paperwork, and avoiding confusion during family dinners. The Romans had a very different system. In many Roman families, sons were often given exactly the same name as their fathers, over and over and over again. Roman male names were built around a three-part structure called the tria nomina. A typical Roman citizen might have a praenomen, a nomen, and a cognomen. But here is where things get repetitive. The praenomen, the personal first name, came from a very small pool of options. Names like Marcus, Gaius, Lucius, Publius, and Quintus were extremely common. In fact, the Romans reused the same dozen or so names constantly. So if a father was named Marcus, there was a very good chance his son would also be Marcus, which means Roman households could easily contain multiple people named Marcus at the same time. Marcus the father, Marcus the son, Marcus the uncle, Marcus the cousin. To make matters slightly more manageable, families sometimes added descriptive nicknames. These could refer to personality traits, achievements, or physical features. For example, the famous Roman leader Gaius Julius Caesar carried a family name that had existed for generations. But even with nicknames, Roman naming conventions could get confusing very quickly. Daughters were handled in an even stranger way. Girls were often named after the family name itself. If the family name was Julius, the daughter would simply be called Julia. If there were multiple daughters, they might be named Julia Major and Julia Minor, which essentially means Julia the older and Julia the younger. Efficient, but not exactly creative. Imagine trying to organise a school classroom where half the students share the same 3 names. Marcus, come here. 3 people stand up. Roman naming traditions made perfect sense within their social structure. Family lineage mattered more than individual identity, so repeating names reinforced the continuity of the family line. But from a modern perspective, it feels slightly chaotic, and it probably made introductions at Roman dinner parties a bit confusing. Hello, I am Marcus. Of course you are. Now imagine living in a world where almost everything could be interpreted as a sign from the gods. A bird flies in the wrong direction. A dog howls in the night. Someone sneezes during an important meeting. In ancient Rome, these things were not random events. They were messages. The Romans believed strongly that the gods communicated through omens. These signs could reveal whether a decision was wise, whether a journey should begin, or whether a battle should be fought. And they took this very seriously. Before major political or military actions, special priests called augurs would examine the behaviour of birds. The direction they flew, the sounds they made, even the way they landed could be interpreted as divine approval, or a very clear warning. Imagine trying to schedule an important meeting today, and someone saying, "Sorry, the pigeons are behaving suspiciously." In Rome, that would have been a legitimate concern. Another form of divination involved examining the internal organs of sacrificed animals. Priests called haruspices would inspect the liver and other organs to determine whether the gods were pleased. If the signs looked unfavourable, the entire plan might be delayed. Sometimes this had very real consequences. Roman generals occasionally postponed battles because the omens were bad. Religious rituals had to be performed correctly before armies marched or political assemblies met. If the signs suggested the gods were unhappy, it was safer to wait. To modern observers, this might sound extremely superstitious, but to the Romans, it was a way of maintaining harmony with the divine forces that controlled the universe. Ignoring omens was considered reckless. Even powerful leaders respected them. The famous Roman statesman Julius Caesar reportedly ignored several warnings before his assassination in 44 BCE, including a famous prophecy that he should beware the Ides of March. History suggests that was not the best decision. For Romans, the world was filled with hidden messages. The gods were constantly watching, and wise people paid attention to the signs. So when a bird flew overhead, or a priest studied a liver, it wasn't just ritual. It was guidance, and sometimes fate. Ancient Rome loved beauty. Appearance mattered, especially among the wealthy. Smooth skin, pale complexions, carefully styled hair, and fashionable clothing were all signs of status and refinement. But the methods Romans used to achieve these beauty standards could be questionable. Roman cosmetics were often made from natural ingredients, which sounds harmless until you look a little closer at what those ingredients actually were. For example, pale skin was considered fashionable among Roman women. It suggested that a person was wealthy enough to stay indoors rather than working under the sun. To achieve this look, some cosmetic powders contained lead. Yes, lead. Roman women applied these mixtures to their faces to create a lighter complexion. At the time, they had no idea the substance was toxic. They only knew that it produced the fashionable pale appearance they wanted. From a modern perspective, it sounds alarming. From a Roman perspective, it was simply makeup. Skin creams and beauty treatments could also include unusual ingredients. Animal fats, crushed minerals, and plant extracts were common components of Roman cosmetics. Some recipes preserved in ancient texts mention even stranger elements. One facial treatment reportedly used crocodile dung mixed with other ingredients to improve skin texture, which sounds less like skincare and more like a very risky science experiment. Hair was another major focus of Roman beauty culture. Wealthy women spent hours arranging elaborate hairstyles with braids, curls, and decorative pins. Some even used wigs made from the hair of enslaved people, imported from distant regions of the empire. Blonde hair was particularly fashionable at times, and Roman women experimented with dyes and powders to achieve the desired colour. Roman men also participated in beauty routines. Grooming, shaving, and maintaining a neat appearance were important parts of Roman social life. Barbershops were busy places where men gathered to have their beards trimmed and hairstyled. Of course, Roman grooming tools were not always gentle. Razor blades could be sharp, and the process could be painful if the barber was inexperienced, which meant that a simple haircut might involve a small amount of courage. Roman beauty culture shows that the desire to look attractive is hardly a modern invention. People 2,000 years ago worried about the same things we do today: clear skin, good hair, and looking impressive in public. The only difference is that their skincare routine occasionally involved materials we would prefer not to put anywhere near our faces. If you walked through the streets of ancient Rome at almost any hour of the day, you would notice something very common. People drinking wine. Morning, afternoon, evening. Wine was everywhere. Now, before we imagine Romans stumbling through the streets constantly intoxicated, there is an important detail. Roman wine was usually diluted with water. Drinking wine straight, without mixing it, was considered uncivilized and something barbarians were rumoured to do. So the Romans mixed their wine carefully, often combining 1 part wine with 2 or 3 parts water. Still, that meant wine was part of daily life. People drank it at meals, during social gatherings, while relaxing in bathhouses, and even while discussing business. It was often safer than drinking untreated water, especially in crowded cities where sanitation could be unpredictable. Wine came in many varieties. Some were light and refreshing, while others were strong and aged. Wealthy Romans prized rare vintages stored in amphorae sealed with wax and labelled with the year of production. Ancient wine collectors existed long before modern sommeliers. Of course, Romans did not stop at simple wine and water. They loved experimenting with flavours. Honey, herbs, spices, and sometimes even seawater were added to create new varieties. One popular drink was mulsum, wine mixed with honey and spices, often served at the beginning of meals, which probably tasted pleasant. Seawater, on the other hand, may have been more of an acquired taste. Large gatherings and dinner parties involved significant amounts of drinking. During banquets, servants refilled cups continuously while guests reclined on couches and talked late into the night. Poets, musicians, and entertainers often performed while the wine flowed freely. Despite the dilution, it was still possible to drink quite a lot over the course of an evening. Roman writers frequently joked about drunken behaviour at parties. Philosophers sometimes complained that too much wine led to poor judgment and embarrassing decisions, which, once again, sounds very familiar. 2,000 years later, people still gather with friends, share drinks, and occasionally regret their choices the next morning. The containers may look different today, but the basic ritual has remained surprisingly unchanged. Ancient Romans understood something about social life that we still practice today. Good conversation often flows a little easier when the wine does too. Now, after a long day of work, bathing, gambling, and possibly drinking diluted wine, Romans wanted entertainment. And Roman entertainment was intense. The most famous example was the gladiatorial games held in massive arenas like the Colosseum. These spectacles drew enormous crowds. Tens of thousands of people filled the stands to watch trained fighters battle each other using swords, shields, nets, and tridents. For the Romans, this was not considered shocking. It was exciting. Gladiators were athletes and celebrities. Skilled fighters developed loyal fan followings, and some even became famous throughout the empire. People admired their courage, their skill, and their ability to survive in the arena. But gladiators were only part of the entertainment. Roman games often included animal hunts called venationes. Exotic animals such as lions, bears, leopards, and even elephants were brought from distant parts of the empire to be displayed or hunted in the arena. Sometimes trained hunters fought the animals. Sometimes criminals were forced to face them. From a modern perspective, this feels brutal. From a Roman perspective, it demonstrated power. The empire controlled lands so vast that wild animals could be transported thousands of kilometers just to appear in a single afternoon of entertainment. The games also included staged reenactments of historical battles or mythological stories. Some amphitheatres even flooded their arenas to stage mock naval battles called naumachiae. Imagine watching an entire lake appear inside a stadium. Roman crowds loved spectacle. They cheered, shouted, waved banners, and reacted passionately to what happened in the arena. Vendors sold food and drinks. People debated the skills of different fighters, and the atmosphere was closer to a modern sports event than a quiet cultural performance. The emperors understood the importance of these games. Providing public entertainment kept the population happy and distracted from political problems. The poet Juvenal famously described this strategy as bread and circuses. As long as the people had food and exciting entertainment, they were less likely to worry about the complicated realities of politics, which might sound surprisingly familiar. 2,000 years later, stadiums still fill with cheering crowds watching athletes compete. The scale may have changed, the rules are definitely safer, but the basic idea remains the same. Humans love spectacle, and the Romans were masters at providing it. Religion in ancient Rome was not something people practiced only on special occasions. It was woven into everyday life. Romans believed the world was filled with gods, spirits, and divine forces that influenced almost everything. From military victories to good harvests, to the simple hope that tomorrow's bread would bake properly. And because the gods were believed to be watching, Romans spent a lot of time communicating with them. Sometimes through prayers, sometimes through offerings, and sometimes through written messages. Across the Roman world, people left small inscriptions dedicated to their gods. These could be carved into stone tablets, written on thin sheets of metal, or engraved onto altars placed in temples. The messages varied widely. Some were simple thank you notes for blessings already received. Others were requests. A merchant might ask the god Mercury for success in business. A soldier might pray to Mars for protection in battle. A traveller might leave an offering for Neptune before sailing across the sea. Religion in Rome was very practical. You asked for help. You offered something in return. And ideally, the gods cooperated. One particularly interesting form of communication involved curse tablets. These were thin pieces of lead, where someone would write a request asking the gods to punish an enemy. The tablet might ask a deity to make a rival lose a race, fall ill, or experience some other form of divine inconvenience. After writing the curse, the tablet would often be folded, pierced with a nail, and placed in a sacred location such as a temple, a well, or even a grave. It was essentially ancient supernatural complaint filing. Instead of writing an angry message online, you asked a god to intervene personally, and many people clearly believed it worked. Temples across the empire collected thousands of small offerings and inscriptions. The walls of shrines were often covered with messages from ordinary people thanking the gods for help or asking for guidance. Religion in ancient Rome was not distant or abstract. It was personal. You talked to the gods the way you might talk to a powerful patron, respectfully, hopefully, and occasionally with a very specific request regarding your annoying neighbour. Now here is one of the most normal parts of Roman life that feels very strange to modern people: childcare. Because in ancient Rome, especially in wealthy households, parents were not always the people spending the most time raising their children. Much of that work was handed off to others. Elite Roman families often relied heavily on enslaved nurses, tutors, attendants, and household staff to care for their sons and daughters from a very young age. A newborn might be fed and watched over by a wet nurse. As the child grew older, other attendants supervised daily routines, education, clothing, manners, and movement through the household. In practical terms, this meant Roman upper-class parenting could look less like modern family life and more like outsourced management, a very elegant form of delegation. The wet nurse was especially important. In many aristocratic households, mothers did not breastfeed their own infants. Instead, a nurse, often an enslaved woman, fed and cared for the baby. Ancient writers actually debated this practice. Some argued that a mother should nurse her own child to create a stronger emotional bond. Others thought the child would be perfectly fine, and by perfectly fine, they meant rich, educated, and slightly emotionally distant, which in fairness described a large portion of the Roman elite. As children got older, they were assigned tutors. Boys from wealthy families were trained in reading, writing, rhetoric, and public behaviour. They were taught how to speak properly, how to carry themselves, and eventually how to function in Roman political and social life. Girls were also educated in many households, though their training focused more on domestic management, family honour, and preparation for marriage. In both cases, much of this instruction came from other adults in the household, not necessarily from the parents themselves. And Roman households could be enormous. They included relatives, clients, servants, enslaved workers, and dependents, all living under one roof or within one domestic complex. So a Roman child grew up not in a small nuclear family, but in a dense social machine. The father remained the legal and symbolic authority. The mother could still be influential, affectionate, and deeply involved. But daily care was often distributed among many people. To the Romans, this was practical and normal. To us, it feels oddly formal, as if family life had been turned into an institution, which, for wealthy Romans, it more or less had been. Chapter 15. Why it all felt normal. And this is really the strangest part of ancient Rome. Not the toilets, not the urine laundry, not the group bathing, the reclining dinners, the gambling, the omens, the beauty creams, or the fact that half the city seemed to be named Marcus. The strangest part is that none of it felt strange to them. That was just life, and that, more than anything else, is what makes ancient Rome so fascinating. When we look back at Roman habits, a lot of them feel bizarre, uncomfortable, or completely unhinged. We look at a communal sponge on a stick and think, absolutely not. We hear about crocodile dung in skincare and think, maybe let us not exfoliate today. We imagine discussing grain prices while sitting in a public toilet beside three strangers and feel our soul quietly leave the room. But the Romans did not experience their world as weird. They experienced it as normal. Because normal is not universal. It is cultural. It is built from what you grow up with, what your society repeats, what your family teaches you, and what everybody around you accepts without question. If everyone you know uses a bathhouse, then bathhouses feel normal. If everyone in your city trusts omens, then birds become important. If everyone is drinking diluted wine at lunch, then that is not alarming. It is just Tuesday, and to be fair, future people may look at us the exact same way. They might stare at our lives in total confusion. You people sat alone in tiny cars for hours every day? You spent half your waking life staring into glowing rectangles? You drank overpriced bean water just to feel human before noon? You answered work emails while on vacation? From their perspective, we might not look especially well-adjusted either. That is the lesson Rome leaves behind. Civilizations are not just remembered for their conquests, monuments and emperors. They are remembered for the little things too. The habits that felt obvious at the time, the routines nobody questioned, the things so ordinary they barely seemed worth mentioning. Until centuries pass. Then suddenly those ordinary habits become the most revealing details of all. Because marble temples tell you what a civilization admired, but bathrooms, dinners, beauty creams, and street food tell you how it actually lived. And ancient Rome, for all its greatness, was gloriously, confidently, sometimes disturbingly human. The first light of morning creeps over the great harbour of Carthage, turning the sea into a sheet of copper and gold. Long before the wealthy merchants of the city wake up, the docks are already alive with noise. Ships creak against wooden piers, sailors shout orders in half a dozen languages, and the smell of salt water mixes with something far more interesting drifting through the air. Food. Carthage was one of the busiest ports in the ancient Mediterranean, a city built on trade and movement. Ships arrived daily from Sicily, Sardinia, Iberia, and the distant Levant. With them came sailors who had been at sea for weeks, dock workers who had been hauling cargo since before sunrise, and traders who had already been negotiating prices before most citizens had opened their eyes. And all of these people had one thing in common: they were hungry. Near the harbour gates, rows of street vendors begin setting up their stalls. Some simply unfold wooden tables, others fire up clay braziers filled with glowing charcoal. Within minutes, the quiet streets transform into a bustling morning market, where breakfast is fast, cheap, and meant to be eaten standing up. One vendor drops small fish into a pan of sizzling oil. The sound alone is enough to make nearby sailors drift closer. These fish were often caught that same morning in the nearby waters of the Mediterranean. Fried quickly and sprinkled with salt and herbs, they become one of the most popular street foods in the harbour district. Next to him, another seller stacks warm barley flatbreads in neat piles. Barley was one of the most common grains in the Carthaginian world, cheaper than wheat, and filling enough to fuel a long day of physical work. Dock workers tear pieces from the bread, dipping them into bowls of olives or soft cheese before heading back to the warehouses. A few steps away, a woman arranges trays of honey cakes. Sticky, golden, and fragrant, they offer a rare bit of sweetness in a world where sugar does not yet exist. Sailors who have just been paid for a delivery sometimes treat themselves to one before returning to their ships. And everywhere, clay cups of diluted wine are passed across counters. In Carthage, wine was rarely drunk straight. Vendors mix it with water and herbs, creating a lighter drink that refreshes workers without leaving them stumbling across the docks. Within an hour, the harbour market is roaring with life. Men eat quickly, wipe their hands on rough tunics, and disappear back into the machinery of trade. Because in Carthage, breakfast is not a leisurely ritual. It is simply fuel for the empire. As the morning grows brighter, the harbour markets of Carthage become even louder. The early rush of sailors and dock workers has not slowed down. In fact, it is only beginning. Ships continue to arrive, cargo keeps moving, and the smell of food spreads through the narrow streets near the port like an invisible invitation. If there is one thing that defines street food in Carthage, it is speed. Nobody here has time for elaborate meals. Sailors may only have a short break before unloading another cargo of amphora. Dock workers are paid by the job, not by the hour. Traders are constantly negotiating prices and arranging shipments. Sitting down for a long meal would be a luxury few can afford. So the food must be simple, and the king of simple meals is bread. Barley flatbread is everywhere in the harbour district. Vendors stack it in large woven baskets, while the smell of warm grain drifts through the air. The bread is dense and slightly rough, nothing like the soft loaves of modern bakeries, but it is filling, durable, and cheap. Three qualities that matter far more to the working crowd. Customers rarely eat it alone. Small clay bowls filled with olives sit on almost every stall. Carthage controlled fertile lands across North Africa, where olive trees grew in abundance. The olives are salty, slightly bitter, and preserved in brine. Dock workers pop them into their mouths between bites of bread, washing everything down with diluted wine. Sometimes the meal becomes a little more interesting. Some vendors offer simple spreads made from crushed herbs, garlic and olive oil. Others sell soft cheese wrapped in leaves, made from goat or sheep milk from farms outside the city. A few lucky customers might even find small pieces of salted fish to place inside their flatbread, turning the humble meal into something closer to a sandwich. But the real skill of these vendors is not cooking. It is efficiency. A customer walks up, tosses a small coin onto the wooden table, grabs bread and olives, and is gone within seconds. There is no waiting, no conversation beyond a quick nod. The next hungry worker steps forward immediately. All around the harbour, hundreds of these transactions happen every hour. Food moves almost as quickly as cargo, and as the sun climbs higher over the Mediterranean, the street vendors know something important. The real lunchtime rush is still coming. By the time the sun climbs higher above the Mediterranean, the harbour district of Carthage has reached its busiest hours. Cargo cranes creak, amphorae clatter onto stone floors, and merchants shout prices across crowded docks. The market streets nearby pulse with the same frantic energy, and now the smell of frying oil dominates the air. If bread and olives are the quickest meals in Carthage, fried fish is easily the most tempting. The fish arrive constantly from small boats that fish the waters just outside the harbour. These fishermen do not travel far. They return early in the morning with baskets filled with sardines, anchovies, and other small Mediterranean fish. The catch is often sold almost immediately to vendors who operate near the docks. Within minutes, those fish are already cooking. Street cooks heat wide bronze or clay pans over charcoal braziers. Olive oil shimmers as it warms, and when the first fish hit the pan, the familiar crackling sound cuts through the noise of the marketplace. Sailors passing by instinctively slow their pace. The aroma is irresistible. The fish are usually prepared in the simplest way possible. They are dusted lightly with barley flour or crushed herbs, then dropped into hot oil. No complicated sauces, no elaborate preparation, just quick frying until the skin turns crisp and golden. Vendors pile the finished fish onto wooden trays, lined with flatbread leaves or woven reeds. A customer can buy a handful for a few small coins. Dock workers often eat them immediately, standing beside the stall while the heat still rises from the food. Some wrap the fish inside barley bread, creating a crude but satisfying sandwich. Others simply sprinkle them with salt and chew quickly before returning to their work. Nearby, another vendor sells something slightly more luxurious. Grilled octopus. The tentacles are charred over open flames, brushed with olive oil and herbs. It takes longer to cook and costs more, so this dish attracts merchants, sailors who have just been paid, or traders celebrating a successful deal. But even here, the rhythm remains fast. Food in the harbour market is not about relaxing. It is about keeping the massive machine of trade running. Ships must sail again soon. Warehouses must be filled. Cargo must move from ship to market and from market to caravan. And every man working the docks knows one thing. A hot piece of fried fish is sometimes the only break he will get all day. As the day progresses in the bustling port city of Carthage, the smells of fried fish and warm bread still dominate the harbour district. Yet tucked among the stalls of grilled seafood and salty olives, another scent quietly pulls people closer. Sweetness. In the ancient Mediterranean, sweet food was not common. There was no refined sugar, no chocolate, and certainly no candy shops. But the people of Carthage had something just as precious. Honey. Beekeeping was widespread across North Africa and the lands controlled by Carthage. Clay hives dotted rural farms, and honey travelled into the city in sealed jars carried by farmers and traders. For street vendors, it was the perfect ingredient for creating small treats that could be sold quickly to hungry customers. One of the most popular was the honey cake. These cakes were small, round, and dense. Vendors made them from barley or wheat flour mixed with crushed nuts, sesame seeds, and generous amounts of honey. The dough was shaped into small discs and baked on flat stones or inside simple clay ovens. Once finished, the cakes were often brushed again with warm honey, giving them a sticky golden surface that glistened in the sun. The trays of cakes quickly attracted attention. Young apprentices from nearby warehouses sometimes spent their few coins on a sweet snack before returning to work. Sailors who had just been paid for a delivery might treat themselves after weeks of eating nothing but ship rations. Even merchants occasionally stopped to buy a cake while discussing trade deals. Some vendors added their own variations. A few sprinkled the cakes with crushed pistachios or sesame seeds. Others added dried figs or dates, fruits that travelled into Carthage through the vast trade network stretching across North Africa and the Near East. Each stall had its own small twist, and regular customers often returned to their favourite vendor. But like everything in the harbour district, the experience was quick. Customers rarely lingered. A honey cake was bought, eaten in a few bites, and the buyer moved on. There were ships to load, contracts to negotiate, and cargo to move. Still, for a brief moment, the sweetness offered a small luxury. Amid the chaos of the docks, the shouting sailors, creaking ships, and endless movement of goods, a simple honey cake reminded people that life in Carthage was not only about trade and labour. Sometimes, it was also about enjoying a small taste of sweetness before returning to the noise of the harbour. By midday, the heat begins to settle heavily over the harbour of Carthage. The stone streets warm under the sun, and the air becomes thick with the smell of fish, olive oil, and baking bread. Dock workers wipe sweat from their foreheads as they haul cargo across the piers, while sailors climb in and out of ships carrying ropes, amphorae, and crates. At this hour, food alone is not enough. People need something to drink. Water exists in the city, of course. Carthage had impressive reservoirs and cisterns that stored rainwater, supplying the population with fresh drinking water. But in the crowded harbour district, many workers prefer something with a little more flavour, and something they trust: wine. But not the kind modern people imagine. In the ancient Mediterranean, drinking undiluted wine was often considered excessive, even barbaric. Carthaginians, like many other cultures of the region, almost always mixed their wine with water. The result was a lighter drink that refreshed workers without overwhelming them. Street vendors near the harbour specialise in these quick drinks. Clay jugs filled with diluted wine sit on wooden tables. Vendors ladle the drink into simple cups made from pottery or metal, handing them across the counter to thirsty sailors. The wine is usually mixed with cool water and sometimes flavoured with herbs. Mint, thyme, or crushed fennel seeds might be added, giving the drink a fresh aroma. Some sellers include a little honey for sweetness, turning the mixture into something almost like a primitive herbal drink. For sailors returning from long journeys, this simple beverage is incredibly welcome. Life at sea often meant drinking stale water stored in wooden barrels. By the time ships reached port, the water could taste unpleasant or even unsafe. A fresh cup of diluted wine, flavoured with herbs, was far more appealing. Dock workers gather briefly around these stalls. They drink quickly, sometimes leaning against walls or crates while they finish their cup. Conversations are short and practical. Discussions about cargo shipments, rumours about arriving fleets, or complaints about the relentless heat. Then the cups are returned. Another worker steps forward. Another ladle dips into the jug. The rhythm continues all afternoon. Because in the harbour of Carthage, drinks are not meant for leisurely afternoons or philosophical debates. They are meant to refresh the body just enough to keep the great engines of trade moving. Ships must sail again soon, and the men who load them cannot afford to slow down. Behind every tray of fried fish and every stack of barley bread in Carthage, there is someone who woke long before sunrise. The street vendors of the harbour district are among the hardest working people in the city. Unlike wealthy merchants who trade across the Mediterranean, these sellers operate on a much smaller scale. Their entire business may consist of a wooden table, a clay oven, a few baskets of ingredients, and a good location near the docks. But location is everything. The best stalls sit along the narrow streets that connect the harbour to the warehouses and markets of the city. Here, the constant flow of sailors, dock workers, and traders guarantees a steady stream of hungry customers. A vendor who secures a good corner can sell hundreds of small meals in a single day. Many vendors come from ordinary Carthaginian families who have worked the harbour markets for generations. Others are migrants from nearby villages or even foreigners who settled in the city through trade networks. Carthage is a cosmopolitan place, and the languages heard behind these food stalls often reflect that diversity. Some vendors specialize in a single dish. A fish seller may focus entirely on frying sardines or anchovies, perfecting the speed and technique needed to serve dozens of customers every hour. A baker might produce nothing but flatbread, stacking warm rounds as quickly as the oven can bake them. Meanwhile, a sweets vendor arranges honey cakes in neat rows, hoping the sticky golden treats catch the eye of passing sailors. The work is constant. Charcoal fires must be kept hot. Oil must be replenished. Bread must be baked again and again as baskets empty. Vendors watch the flow of the crowd carefully, adjusting their pace depending on when ships arrive or when dock workers take short breaks from their labour. Competition is fierce. Several stalls might sell similar foods only a few steps apart. A vendor who cooks faster, offers slightly fresher fish, or adds an extra drizzle of honey might attract more customers. Reputation spreads quickly in the harbour district, and regular workers often return to the same stall every day. Despite the noise and chaos of the docks, a certain rhythm develops. Coins clink on wooden tables. Food changes hands. Workers eat quickly and disappear back into the machinery of trade. By the afternoon, many vendors are already preparing for the next wave of hungry customers, because when the ships unload their cargo and new crews step onto the docks, the harbour streets of Carthage will once again fill with people looking for a fast, satisfying meal. One of the reasons street food in Carthage was so interesting is simple. The city sat at the centre of a massive trading network. Ships constantly arrived from across the Mediterranean world, bringing metals, fabrics, spices, animals, and grain. But along with cargo, they also carried something less obvious: ingredients and culinary ideas from distant lands. The harbour markets reflected that diversity. A sailor arriving from the Iberian coast might recognise certain salted fish, prepared in ways similar to those eaten in western ports. Traders from Sicily could find familiar olives and cheeses. Merchants from the Levant sometimes spotted dishes that reminded them of the eastern Mediterranean, where Carthage's own Phoenician ancestors had once lived. Street food in the harbour district slowly absorbed all these influences. Olives remained a staple, but they were sometimes seasoned with herbs imported from distant regions. Flatbreads might be sprinkled with sesame seeds that arrived through long trade routes stretching toward the Near East. Honeycakes occasionally included nuts brought from lands across the sea. Even fish preparation could vary depending on the vendor. Some cooks preferred simple frying in olive oil. Others rubbed fish with crushed herbs before cooking. A few experimented with sauces made from fermented fish paste, something sailors from other Mediterranean cultures already recognized as a familiar flavor. These small variations turned the harbour markets into a kind of culinary crossroads. A dock worker eating lunch might unknowingly be tasting ingredients that travelled hundreds or even thousands of kilometres before reaching his plate. A sailor resting after a voyage could find foods that felt both foreign and strangely familiar. For Carthage itself, this diversity was a source of pride. The city had been founded by Phoenician settlers centuries earlier, but it grew into one of the richest trading powers in the ancient world. Its merchants controlled shipping routes across North Africa, Spain, Sicily, and beyond. Every arriving ship strengthened that network, and the harbour markets displayed that wealth in everyday form. Unlike grand banquets held in wealthy houses, street food was accessible to almost everyone. Sailors, traders, labourers and travellers all ate from the same stalls. The ingredients might come from many lands, but the experience remained simple. Eat quickly, return to work, watch another ship arrive. In this way, the street food of Carthage quietly mirrored the very nature of the city itself, a place where cultures met, goods exchanged hands, and the entire Mediterranean seemed to pass through its busy harbour streets. As the afternoon slowly fades into evening, the harbour of Carthage begins to change its rhythm. The intense rush of the day starts to soften. Some ships have already departed with the falling wind, while others remain tied to the docks for the night. Dock workers finish their final loads, merchants count their coins, and sailors stretch their tired backs after long hours of labour. But the food stalls do not close yet. In fact, the evening often brings a second wave of customers. Sailors who spent the entire day repairing sails or unloading cargo finally have time to eat properly. Warehouse guards beginning their night shifts stop by for a quick meal. Traders who spent hours negotiating prices now wander the harbour streets, looking for something warm before returning to their lodgings. The vendors prepare accordingly. Charcoal braziers are stirred back to life, sending small sparks floating into the evening air. Fish continues to sizzle in oil, though the pace is slower now. Bread sellers bring out fresh batches of flatbreads baked earlier in the day, warming them briefly over the coals to restore their softness. Some stalls offer slightly heavier meals during the evening hours. Bowls of stewed lentils appear on wooden counters, thick and filling. Lentils were a staple food across the Mediterranean world, cheap to produce and packed with nutrition. The stew is usually flavoured with garlic, herbs and olive oil, creating a comforting dish that warms tired workers after a long day. Others serve small portions of roasted meat. Goat or lamb might be cooked on skewers over open flames, though these dishes cost more and are considered a modest luxury compared to bread or fish. A sailor who has just been paid for a successful voyage might splurge on such a meal, enjoying something richer before returning to his ship. Nearby, wine sellers continue pouring diluted wine mixed with herbs. The atmosphere becomes slightly more relaxed. Conversations last longer now. Sailors share stories about storms they survived or distant ports they visited. Dock workers complain about difficult supervisors or laugh about small victories from the day. The harbour lights flicker to life. Simple oil lamps hung outside stalls or carried by vendors themselves. Their glow reflects off bronze cooking pans and clay jars, casting warm light across the busy street. Even in the evening, the food of Carthage remains simple and practical. But for a brief moment, the harbour feels less like a machine of trade and more like a gathering place for the thousands of people who keep the great city alive. As night settles over the harbour of Carthage, the last food stalls begin to close. The fires beneath the clay braziers fade into glowing embers, and the trays that once held fried fish, honey cakes, and stacks of barley bread are slowly emptied. Vendors count their coins under the soft light of oil lamps while the distant sound of waves taps gently against the stone docks. The harbour grows quieter, but the story of its food remains. Street food in Carthage was never meant to be elegant. It was not the lavish banquets of wealthy merchants or the ceremonial feasts held in the homes of powerful families. Instead, it belonged to the working life of the city, the sailors, traders, dock workers, and travellers who pass through the harbour every day. And yet, these simple meals reveal something remarkable about the city itself. Carthage was one of the greatest trading powers of the ancient Mediterranean. Its ships sailed to Iberia for silver, to Sicily for grain, to North Africa for olives and livestock, and across the sea toward the lands of the eastern Mediterranean, where the Phoenician ancestors of the Carthaginians once lived. All of those connections quietly appeared in the harbour markets. The olives eaten by dock workers came from fertile groves across North Africa. The fish frying in bronze pans were pulled from the nearby Mediterranean waters. The honey and sweet cakes arrived from rural farms, while nuts and herbs travelled through trade networks that stretched across continents. Every bite carried the fingerprints of an empire built on commerce. For the sailors resting on the docks, however, the meaning was much simpler. After weeks at sea, the smell of frying fish and fresh bread meant they had reached a safe harbour. For dock workers, a handful of olives and a cup of diluted wine provided just enough energy to survive another exhausting shift. The meals were quick, the ingredients were simple, but together they formed the daily rhythm of life in Carthage. Tomorrow morning the harbour will wake again before sunrise. New ships will appear on the horizon. Vendors will reopen their stalls, lighting fresh charcoal fires and stacking baskets of bread. And once again, sailors and labourers will crowd the market streets. Because in a city built on trade, the engines of commerce never truly stop. They simply pause long enough for a quick meal before beginning again. Long before he marched war elephants through the mountains and sent waves of panic through Rome, the boy who would become Hannibal Barca was born into a world already shaped by rivalry, defeat, and revenge. His home was the powerful maritime city of Carthage, one of the richest trading empires in the ancient Mediterranean. From its great harbours, fleets of merchant ships sailed constantly towards Spain, Sicily, Sardinia, and the distant coasts of Africa. Markets overflowed with silver, ivory, grain, and spices. To outsiders, Carthage appeared unstoppable. But beneath the wealth and prestige, a bitter humiliation lingered. Only a few years before Hannibal's birth, Carthage had suffered a devastating defeat in the First Punic War. After decades of brutal fighting over control of Sicily, Rome had finally forced Carthage to surrender. The terms were harsh. Carthage lost important territories, paid enormous war reparations, and watched Rome emerge as the dominant naval power in the western Mediterranean. For many Carthaginians, the defeat was unbearable. Among those who felt the humiliation most deeply was Hannibal's father, Hamilcar Barca. A brilliant military commander, Hamilcar had fought Rome fiercely during the final years of the war. Though he could not prevent Carthage's defeat, he never accepted it as final. Instead, he began planning for the future. Hamilcar believed that Carthage's recovery would come from rebuilding power far from Roman influence. His solution lay across the sea in Iberia, a region rich in silver mines, fertile lands, and potential soldiers. If Carthage could establish a strong base there, it could rebuild its army, restore its wealth, and one day challenge Rome again. And Hannibal grew up surrounded by these ambitions. As a child, he listened to conversations about war, strategy, and revenge. The atmosphere of his household was not one of quiet diplomacy, but of determination and preparation. Carthage might have lost one war, but the struggle with Rome was far from over. According to ancient historians, Hamilcar even made his young son swear an oath. Standing before the gods, Hannibal promised that he would never be a friend of Rome. Whether the story is legend or truth, the meaning behind it is unmistakable. From the beginning of his life, Hannibal Barca was raised not simply as a noble child of Carthage, but as a future enemy of Rome. The story of Hannibal Barca often begins with a moment that later historians would repeat for centuries: a young boy standing beside his father, a sacred altar, and an oath that would shape the fate of the Mediterranean. According to ancient writers like Polybius, Hannibal's father, Hamilcar Barca, brought his son to a temple before leaving Carthage for a new military campaign. There, he asked the boy a simple question. Did he wish to come with him on the expedition? Young Hannibal eagerly agreed. But before allowing him to join the journey, Hamilcar required something more serious. He placed his son before the sacred altar and made him swear that he would never be a friend of Rome. Whether every detail of the story is perfectly true or not, it captures the spirit of Hannibal's upbringing. Rome was not simply a rival city. In the Barca family, it was the enemy responsible for humiliating Carthage and threatening its future. Soon after this moment, Hannibal left the familiar streets of Carthage and sailed west with his father. Their destination was Iberia. For Hamilcar, Iberia represented opportunity. The region was rich in natural resources, especially silver, and its tribes could provide strong warriors for a rebuilt Carthaginian army. If Carthage could control this territory, it could regain the wealth and power lost after the First Punic War. For Hannibal, the journey was the beginning of his education. Instead of growing up in the quiet luxury of Carthaginian noble life, he spent his youth in military camps. He watched soldiers train, listened to discussions of strategy, and observed his father negotiating alliances with local tribes. The rugged landscapes of Iberia became his classroom. There he learned how armies move across mountains and rivers. He learned how to command the loyalty of diverse troops: Libyans, Iberians, Numidians, and Carthaginians. Most importantly, he learned how to think like a general. By the time Hannibal reached his teenage years, he was no longer simply the son of a famous commander. He had already begun absorbing the knowledge that would later make him one of the most feared military minds in history. and in the back of his mind, the oath still remained. Rome would one day have to answer for Carthage's defeat. By the time Hannibal Barca reached adulthood, Iberia had become far more than a distant frontier of the Carthaginian world. Under the leadership of his father, Hamilcar Barca, the region had slowly transformed into the foundation of a new Carthaginian power. But Hamilcar's ambitious project did not last forever. During a campaign against local tribes, Hamilcar was killed in battle. The loss could have shattered Carthage's position in Iberia. Instead, leadership passed to another capable member of the Barca family, Hamilcar's son-in-law, Hasdrubal the Fair. Hasdrubal approached expansion differently than his predecessor. Where Hamilcar had relied heavily on military campaigns, Hasdrubal preferred diplomacy. He negotiated alliances with Iberian tribes, established administrative control over new territories, and founded an important city on the southeastern coast known as Carthago Nova. The city would soon become the political and economic centre of Carthaginian Iberia. Throughout these years, Hannibal continued learning. He served as an officer in the army, gaining first-hand experience in leadership and warfare. Soldiers quickly noticed his unusual qualities. Unlike many commanders who remained distant from their troops, Hannibal shared their hardships. He marched beside them, endured the same weather, and slept in the same rough camps. This earned him deep loyalty. Ancient historians later wrote that soldiers admired his courage and energy. He could move tirelessly across difficult terrain, riding for long distances without rest. In battle exercises, he demonstrated a sharp understanding of tactics and an ability to read the battlefield quickly. But his rise truly began after another sudden change. Hasdrubal the Fair was assassinated by a local tribesman. The Carthaginian army suddenly found itself without a commander in Iberia. The decision about leadership now rested with the soldiers and Carthaginian officials in the region. The army made its choice quickly. Hannibal was only in his mid-20s, but the troops already trusted him. They proclaimed him their new general, and Carthage confirmed the decision soon afterward. With that moment, the young officer who had grown up in military camps suddenly held command of one of the most powerful armies in the western Mediterranean. And now, with Iberia firmly under Carthaginian influence, Hannibal began looking toward the enemy his father had never forgotten: Rome. With command of the Carthaginian army in Iberia, Hannibal Barca now controlled a powerful and experienced force. Years of expansion had given Carthage wealth from silver mines, loyal Iberian allies, and thousands of hardened soldiers. But the growing strength of Carthage in Iberia did not go unnoticed. Across the Mediterranean, Rome watched the situation carefully. Although the two powers were not technically at war, suspicion remained high after the bitter struggles of the First Punic War. Both sides understood that the peace between them was fragile. To prevent conflict, earlier agreements had tried to divide influence in Iberia. The Ebro Treaty supposedly established that Carthaginian armies would not expand north of the Ebro River. In theory, this boundary would keep the two powers from interfering with each other's interests. But there was one major complication. South of that river stood the wealthy city of Saguntum. Although located within territory influenced by Carthage, Saguntum had formed a political alliance with Rome. To Hannibal, the situation was unacceptable. From his perspective, Saguntum represented a Roman foothold deep inside Carthaginian territory. If left alone, it could become a base for Roman expansion into Iberia. More importantly, Hannibal understood something fundamental about Rome. The Republic rarely abandoned its allies. By confronting Saguntum, he could force Rome into a difficult decision. Around 219 before the Common Era, Hannibal marched his army toward the city and began a siege. The walls of Saguntum were strong, and its defenders resisted fiercely. The siege dragged on for months as Carthaginian troops surrounded the city, cutting off supplies and slowly tightening their grip. Inside the walls, the inhabitants sent desperate messages to Rome asking for help, but Roman politics moved slowly. Debates dragged on while Hannibal's forces continued their assault. Eventually, after months of fighting, Saguntum fell. The city was captured and destroyed, and its wealth was distributed among Hannibal's troops. For Hannibal, the victory secured Carthaginian authority in Iberia. For Rome, however, it was something else entirely, an insult. Roman envoys soon arrived in Carthage demanding justice. They insisted that Hannibal be handed over for attacking a Roman ally. Carthage refused, and with that refusal, the fragile peace between the two great powers finally shattered. The destruction of Saguntum did more than anger Rome, it made war inevitable. Roman envoys travelled to Carthage, demanding that the city punish Hannibal Barca for attacking a Roman ally. According to later accounts, one Roman ambassador dramatically gathered the folds of his robe and told the Carthaginian council that he carried either peace or war inside it. When the Carthaginians replied that Rome could choose whichever it preferred, the ambassador released the folds and declared that he delivered war. Thus began the Second Punic War, one of the most dramatic and dangerous conflicts in ancient history. Rome's leaders believed they understood how the war would unfold. Their plan was simple. One Roman army would invade North Africa and attack Carthage directly. Another would sail to Iberia to destroy Hannibal's power base. If everything went according to plan, Rome would crush Carthage before the conflict could grow larger. But Hannibal had no intention of waiting passively. Instead of defending Iberia or returning to Carthage, he conceived a plan so bold that it shocked even his own allies. Rather than fighting Rome on distant frontiers, he would carry the war directly into Italy itself, the very heart of Roman power. The idea was dangerous. To reach Italy by land, Hannibal would have to march his army across enormous distances. His forces would need to pass through hostile territories, cross powerful rivers, and somehow navigate the massive mountain barrier separating Gaul from Italy, the Alps. Most commanders would have considered such a journey impossible. The Alps were known for their steep cliffs, narrow paths, freezing temperatures, and unpredictable weather. Even experienced traders struggled to cross them safely. But Hannibal believed the risk was worth it. If he could bring an army into Italy, he might encourage Rome's enemies and subject peoples to rebel. Many Italian communities had been forced into alliance with Rome over the years. Hannibal hoped that once they saw a powerful Carthaginian army on Roman soil, they would abandon Rome and join his cause. To attempt this plan, Hannibal assembled a remarkable force. Thousands of Iberian and Libyan soldiers marched under his command. Skilled Numidians provided fast and deadly cavalry, and among the army's most unusual assets were several massive animals rarely seen on European battlefields. War elephants. Soon the army began its long march northward, and the most famous journey of the ancient world was about to begin. When Hannibal Barca finally began his march from Iberia, he was leading one of the most unusual armies the ancient Mediterranean had ever seen. The force was not made up of a single people. Instead, it was a mixture of cultures and warriors gathered from across the growing Carthaginian sphere of influence. Iberian infantry marched beside seasoned Libyan soldiers. Fast-moving Numidians rode ahead as scouts. There were Balearic slingers known for their deadly accuracy, along with heavy cavalry that could break enemy lines in battle. And towering above them all were the animals that would later become legendary, war elephants. These massive creatures had been used in battle by several Mediterranean powers, but their presence in Hannibal's army made the coming campaign even more intimidating. For enemies who had never seen such animals before, the sight alone could cause panic. Hannibal's plan was simple in concept, but enormous in scale. He would march north through Iberia, cross the wide waters of the Rhone River, and then push his army through the towering barrier of the Alps. If successful, he would emerge directly in northern Italy, where Roman forces would least expect him. The early stages of the march were already difficult. Some Iberian tribes resisted Hannibal's passage, forcing him to fight small battles to secure safe routes. Other tribes demanded tribute or alliances before allowing his army to pass through their territories. Every river crossing required careful planning, as thousands of men, horses and supplies had to be transported safely. Roman scouts soon began reporting the astonishing movement. At first, Roman leaders struggled to believe it. The idea that a foreign army would attempt to cross the Alps seemed almost absurd. Most Roman commanders expected the war to be fought in Iberia, or perhaps in North Africa. But Hannibal continued moving. By the time Roman armies began reacting, he had already reached the Rhone River and successfully crossed it, using rafts and clever engineering to move his soldiers and animals across the wide current. Now only one obstacle remained between Hannibal and Italy: the Alps. Ahead of him rose jagged peaks, narrow mountain paths, and brutal cold that many soldiers had never experienced before. The journey would test the endurance of every man in the army. But turning back was not an option. Hannibal had already committed himself to the most daring gamble of the war. As Hannibal Barca and his army approached the towering peaks of the Alps, even the most experienced soldiers began to understand the scale of the challenge before them. The mountains seemed endless. Sharp cliffs rose into the clouds, and narrow paths twisted along dangerous slopes where a single misstep could send a man tumbling into deep ravines. Many of Hannibal's troops had never seen snow before. The cold winds sweeping down the mountains felt harsh and unfamiliar. Yet the march began. Local mountain tribes watched the approaching army with suspicion. Some groups attacked the Carthaginians from above, hurling rocks and launching sudden ambushes along the narrow trails. Hannibal had to constantly send soldiers ahead to secure the path while the rest of the army struggled behind them. Progress was painfully slow. Pack animals slipped on icy ground. Wagons carrying supplies broke apart on rocky slopes. Horses and mules occasionally lost their footing and fell down the mountainside. Every day brought new obstacles. The elephants, though powerful, faced their own challenges. The animals were not accustomed to the freezing conditions of the high mountains. Their handlers worked constantly to keep them calm and moving forward. Sometimes paths had to be widened or cleared to allow the enormous creatures to pass. Despite these hardships, Hannibal's leadership remained steady. He rode among the troops, encouraging them and sharing their struggles. Ancient historians later described how he pointed toward the distant plains of Italy from mountain heights, reminding his exhausted soldiers that victory and rich lands lay just beyond the peaks. But the crossing became even worse. A sudden snowstorm struck the army, covering the trails and making the already dangerous paths nearly invisible. Soldiers slipped on frozen ground. Supplies ran low. Hunger and exhaustion spread through the ranks. Still, the army pushed forward. After weeks of brutal marching, the Carthaginians finally descended from the mountains into northern Italy. The army that emerged from the Alps was smaller than the one that had begun the journey, but it was still formidable, and more importantly, it had accomplished something Rome never believed possible. An enemy army had crossed the Alps. Now Hannibal stood on Roman soil. The real war was about to begin. When news reached Rome that Hannibal Barca had crossed the Alps, many Romans could hardly believe it. For generations, the Alps had served as a natural barrier protecting Italy from large invading armies. While small tribal raids occasionally crossed the mountains, no major foreign army had ever attempted such a dangerous journey. Now Hannibal had done exactly that. Even worse, he had arrived with a battle-hardened army. The Roman Republic quickly mobilized its forces. Roman legions marched north to confront the invaders before they could move deeper into Italy. Roman commanders believed that once they met Hannibal in open battle, their disciplined legions would quickly crush his multinational army. But Hannibal had already begun shaping the battlefield. Many local tribes in northern Italy had long resented Roman control. When Hannibal arrived, some of these groups saw him as an opportunity to weaken Roman authority. Gradually, warriors from these tribes began joining his forces, increasing the size of his army again after the losses suffered in the mountains. Soon the first major clash occurred near the Ticinus River. Roman cavalry forces met Hannibal's mounted troops, including the famous Numidians, who were known for their speed and flexibility in combat. In this encounter, Hannibal's cavalry proved superior, defeating the Roman horsemen and forcing them to retreat. It was only a small battle, but it carried enormous significance. For the first time, Roman soldiers had faced Hannibal's army on Italian soil. and they had been beaten. The Roman commander wounded during the fighting barely escaped with his life. As the surviving Roman troops withdrew, they realized that the war had taken a dangerous turn. Hannibal was not simply raiding the frontier, he had brought a serious army into Italy, and he intended to fight Rome directly. Soon larger battles would follow, and each one would push the Roman Republic closer to panic. After emerging from the Alps, Hannibal Barca wasted no time proving that his astonishing march into Italy had not been a desperate gamble. It was the opening move of a devastating campaign. Following the early cavalry clash near the Ticinus River, Roman commanders rushed to assemble larger armies to stop him. The Roman Republic had enormous manpower, and its leaders believed that sheer numbers and discipline would overwhelm Hannibal before he could gain a foothold. But Hannibal had a different kind of advantage. He understood how Roman armies fought. Roman commanders preferred straightforward battles. Their legions advanced in powerful formations, relying on discipline, heavy infantry, and direct confrontation. Hannibal, however, preferred something far more dangerous: flexibility, deception, and surprise. Soon the two sides met again near the Trebia River. The Roman army believed it had cornered Hannibal and prepared for a traditional engagement, but Hannibal had carefully prepared the battlefield in advance. Hidden soldiers waited in ambush, while his cavalry and infantry positioned themselves to trap the Roman forces once the fighting began. When the battle erupted, Hannibal's plan unfolded perfectly. As Roman soldiers pushed forward through freezing water and muddy ground, Carthaginian troops attacked from multiple directions. Hannibal's hidden forces suddenly struck from behind, trapping the Roman army in a deadly encirclement. The result was chaos. Roman formations broke apart under the pressure. Thousands of soldiers were killed or captured as the Carthaginian army crushed the Roman legions. Only a portion of the Roman force managed to escape. News of the defeat spread rapidly across Italy. For the first time in generations, a foreign army was winning major victories on Roman soil. Panic began to ripple through Roman cities and allied communities. Some Italian tribes started reconsidering their loyalty to Rome, wondering whether the Carthaginian general might actually defeat the powerful republic. And Hannibal was only getting started. The victory at the Trebia River proved something important. The army that had marched across Iberia, crossed the Rhone, and survived the brutal journey over the Alps was not just a daring expedition. It was a lethal force capable of defeating Rome's legions on their own land. Soon even greater battles would follow, and the name Hannibal would become one that Roman parents used to frighten their children. Every powerful civilization in history had one thing in common: someone had to pay for it. Temples, armies, roads, palaces, irrigation canals, massive city walls. None of these appeared out of thin air. Behind every monument and every empire stood a system that quietly pulled resources from the population and delivered them into the hands of rulers. Taxes. In the ancient world, taxation looked very different from the modern systems we know today. There were no digital forms, no accountants filing annual returns, and certainly no polite reminder emails from the government. Instead, taxes often arrived in far more direct ways. Farmers handed over portions of their harvest. Merchants paid fees at city gates. Craftsmen surrendered goods or labour. Sometimes entire villages were required to provide workers for state projects or military campaigns. And rulers were rarely shy about collecting what they believed was owed. In ancient Egypt, taxation was built directly into the agricultural cycle. When the Nile flooded and fertile soil spread across the fields, scribes and officials followed closely behind. They measured the land, recorded harvest estimates, and calculated how much grain each farmer owed to the state. That grain filled enormous storage complexes controlled by the pharaohs. These massive reserves fed royal workers, supported temple priests, and sustained soldiers during military campaigns. Without these taxes, Egypt's monumental projects, including pyramids and temples, could never have been built. Other civilizations used equally creative systems. In ancient Rome, taxes funded armies, roads, and public infrastructure across a rapidly expanding empire. Some taxes targeted trade, others targeted property, and a few targeted things so strange that modern readers still raise their eyebrows. One Roman emperor even created a tax on urine. Meanwhile, far across the ocean, the rulers of the Aztec Empire demanded tribute from conquered territories in the form of cacao beans, textiles, feathers, and precious goods.